Hello, everyone. Welcome to the last lecture on system security. And the headline today will be access control. So what is this about is really the situation we also talked about last time, namely you have your trusted computing base. It's sitting here. We have some subject, some active person, the user, software process that says, I would like to do some operation, please, on some object O, and the trusted computing base has to decide, does it want to allow this or not? And what it does, in principle at least, is it must consult the security policy to figure out whether this should be allowed or not. But again, the problem here, of course, is that security policy might not be something that a computer system would have an easy time reading and interpreting if it was just from the beginning actually a humanly readable piece of text. So we need to figure out some way in which we can store this information here inside the trusted computing base in such a way that it's actually possible to take a decision efficiently. And also we need to think about what do we do, what are the consequences if the policy, the access rights in the system would change over time. So the first and most basic concept we need to think about here is something called the access control matrix. So this is actually not a matrix that is stored any particular place in the system. That would probably not be very efficient, but it's an abstract matrix that we can think about as representing what is currently allowed in the system. And the idea is very simple. We have this big matrix here, and then it's indexed in one direction by subjects, in another direction by the objects. And then the idea would be that in here, if this access control matrix is called A, we'll have the entry corresponding to subject S and object O would be a bunch of access rights or various operations that this particular subject here is allowed to do on the involved object in that entry of the matrix. So in a certain sense, you can say this represents all of the rules for access that we have in our system. So for a big system, it's clear this is going to be a really, really big matrix. And what you want to do for efficiency in practice is probably not to store the access control matrix in one place and then refer to that particular piece of storage every time you have to make a decision. So there are basically different ways in which you can get around the problem of having to store all this stuff in one place. So one approach to this is to say, we'll take an object, and then for each object, we will store the column involved here, or at least something to that effect, will be stored with the object. So this is known as an access control list. And this is what is being done in Unix or Unix-like systems. Typically with files, you will have a piece of information stored that will tell the system what are different users allowed to do on this particular file. Of course, if you have many users, you would, in principle, you would have to store a very long list here with one entry for each user. But of course, this is not practical. So what you do, like Unix, for example, is you divide users into groups. And then you say, well, I'll describe for you what the owner of the file is allowed to do and what the people in the user group of the owner are allowed to do, and then what everyone is allowed to do. And this can be different kinds of operations you're allowed to do, like execute, write, delete, whatever. The other approach is that you store, in principle, a row of the matrix. So you store this with the subject in question here. So the idea here would be that this is known as user capabilities, and is the kind of approach that, for instance, Windows follows. So you have for each user, or maybe for each type of user, you have a bunch of capabilities that describe what is this type of user allowed to do to different types of objects. And of course, these two approaches are incomparable because depending on what you do, there'll be various questions that you will have a hard time answering or an easy time answering. If you do the Unix way, then if you want to have a complete overview of what can a particular user do, that's going to be hard because you're going to have to go over a lot of objects to figure this out. Correspondingly, if you do the Windows approach with the user capabilities list, then you'll be in more trouble. You can easily figure out, of course, what can a particular subject do. But if you want to know what can happen in the system to a particular file, that can be a more hard question to answer. So fair enough. This is kind of the techniques that people use in practice for this. And then I want to talk a little bit about now what are the consequences? What can we do in case you have what is known as dynamic access control? So that means that what happens if the access control matrix would change over time? What can be the consequences of this? So what we would want to look at here is typically, let's suppose that we have a situation where the current access control matrix has the following property, that there is some particular access right R which is not in the entry of the access control matrix corresponding to a certain subject and a certain object. In other words, this particular subject S is not allowed to do R on the object O. But then things change over time. Rules get updated according to, let's say, certain different events that might happen in the system. And as a consequence of this, we might, over time, end up with a different access control matrix. And now the question is, could it be the case that when this has all happened, that now, in fact, this access control right R is, in fact, in that entry of the new matrix? So given that we know about the events that might happen in the system, we might want to ask ourselves, can this happen? So, for instance, can this guy ever get the right to read this file? If we have a certain idea of the events that might happen in the system, what kinds of updates might be possible for the access control matrix? If we know something about how it might be updated, can we then answer this question? So there is a famous result by some guys called Aho, Russell, and Ullman, who have studied this problem. And in order to tell you exactly what they were able to prove, I have to give you a little bit more formal framework for asking such a question as this one. So let's say that we have, first of all, a bunch of primitive operations. So the most basic operations you can do in the system. And this would be create or delete an object or a subject from the system. So we're saying as time passes, the set of objects and subjects is not stable. It might change. It might become bigger, become smaller. And also, you might want to add or delete some access right R from the access control matrix. So, yeah, these are the most basic operations you can imagine. And then what these guys did was they said, okay, let's define also some more high-level operations that could happen, which is something that they call commands. So command in their notation has a name, and it has a parameter list. I'll get back to what that parameter list contains, but then there is, down here, there is a list of conditions. So condition says R1 is in the current access control matrix under entry S101. And then there is, a whole bunch of things like this down to Rn is in A of S N On. And the idea is that these conditions here, so what happens is the parameter list here will contain a whole bunch of references to rights and subjects and objects, and you use the parameter list to fill in all the stuff that's here with concrete values when the command is called. So when you fill in those concrete values, all these conditions might be satisfied, or maybe they're not all satisfied. But the idea is if they are all satisfied, then there's a list down here of primitive operations. And if all the conditions are satisfied, then this list of primitive operations is executed, otherwise it's not. Okay, so this gives you a more high-level idea of the kinds of changes that might happen. So now we can ask the following, the question I was asking about before. Can this guy ever get the right to access this file, for instance? We can ask this question in a more formal way now. So the idea is the following. Let's say that we are given an access control matrix A, and we are given a list of commands where, so let's call this com1, com2, etc. A list of commands, finite list, where each command is something of this form that we talked about up here. And then we have the situation that, say, A satisfies that a certain right, again, is not in a certain entry of the access control matrix. And then we can ask the following question: does there exist a sequence of commands? So com I1, com I2, etc., with the property that after we execute these commands, and so then we have a new access control matrix A prime, then we want that this access right out from before is in fact in the new matrix that we have after we've executed this particular sequence of commands here. So does there exist such a sequence of commands? And we also say, for short, we say that the question here, we say what we're asking is that we say, is R safe with respect to that particular access control matrix, this particular place. Oh, sorry, I switched those. Let's try again. Is it safe with respect to this is why it's safe with respect to this particular place in the access control matrix and that particular list of possible commands that might change the access control matrix. So this is simply a more formal way of asking this question I was talking about before. Can we determine if we have a specification of how the access control matrix might change that comes with these commands here, and this guy's subject is currently not allowed to do access right R on object O, then is it possible with these commands to change the access control matrix into a new one where in fact this guy is allowed to execute R on O? So what these guys show, as a theorem, is that if commands are allowed to have more than one primitive operation, So remember, command was this thing. It says if a bunch of conditions are satisfied, then I do this list of primitive operations. If that list is allowed to have more than one primitive operation in it, then the question above, is R safe, is in fact undecidable. I would assume that most of you heard about undecidable problems before, but just let me remind you that what this means is that a problem is undecidable. It's hard in a really, really strong sense, because what it means is that any program that would try to decide whether the answer is yes or no to the question would either never stop or would sometimes give the wrong answer. So that's really tough, in other words. You might remember from what you heard before that something called the halting problem is in fact undecidable. In fact, the reason for mentioning this is because, in fact, what these guys do is they show this theorem using the fact that the halting problem is known to be undecidable. They say that what we can do is we can set up an access control matrix A here and a bunch of commands in such a way that executing a sequence of commands corresponds to executing a certain Turing machine. And then you can encode the problem, does this Turing machine halt, by asking one of these safety questions here. So that would then imply that if this problem of is R safe with respect to blah, 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 if that was decidable, then the halting problem would also be decidable. We know it's not. So therefore, this problem here, the safety problem, is also undecidable. There are some exceptions here. So if commands have only one primitive operation, then in fact the problem is decidable. And also, if we know a certain fixed upper bound, that's also what they show. If we know a certain fixed upper bound on the maximum number of subjects and objects we can ever have in the system, then the problem also becomes decidable. But anyway, I think the main take-home message from this is that if you are dealing with dynamic access control, then please, for God's sake, keep it simple, because there is very heavy theoretical evidence from this theorem here that if you don't do that, if things get too complicated, it might explode in your face, and you will have a very hard time analyzing what is going to happen in the future with your system. So that was the last words I had on access control, and this was actually the end of the system security talks.